I've already said to my listeners, I've just finished reading the definitive book on September 11, Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. Don't take my word for it. Listen to these words. Of the raft of books that are marking the 20th anniversary of 9/11 and its aftermath, few are likely to be as meticulously documented, as fluidly written, or as replete with riveting detail as Peter Bergen's The Rise and Fall of Osama bin Laden. It's a page-turner that weaves back and forth between the man and the terrorist, providing poignant glimpses of key figures and carefully chronicling all the missed opportunities, ignored warnings, and strategic blunders of the United States. I concur, and this is Peter Bergen. Peter, congratulations. It's terrific. I've had the privilege of interviewing you many times over the last 20 years. You really brought it home in this manuscript.
Thank you, Michael.
So the book opens. I'm kind of torn because there's so much that I want to ask about, and I know we're limited on time, but I think I'll approach it this way. The book opens with you taking us into the Abbottabad compound and telling us what life was like for bin Laden in the years that he resided there. He has multiple wives. It's a complicated picture. Some who are living in the compound never even put eyes on him. True?
Yeah, so there were 27 people living in the compound, by my count, and 16 of bin Laden's family, so 3 wives and his 11 kids and grandkids. And then there were 11 members of the bodyguards and a family and members with the 2 bodyguards. One of the wives of the bodyguards didn't know that one of the people living on the compound was Osama bin Laden. So he was hiding from people who even lived with him. He was being exceptionally careful. In those last weeks of his life, we have a bin Laden family journal that was only released at the end of the 2017 by the Trump administration. It really kind of documents day by day what the bin Laden family were thinking and doing. In particular, bin Laden's conversations with his 2 oldest wives. Listeners and viewers might be surprised that 2 of bin Laden's oldest wives both had PhDs and were highly educated, and bin Laden really relied on them for sort of strategic advice to help him write his speeches, to think through big problems.
He was going to extraordinary lengths to protect his whereabouts, not the least of which was burning the trash. I didn't know that via one of his wives, he had 4 of them, right? 4 wives?
He had 4 wives, 3 of them were with him at the compound.
3 of whom were in the compound. Okay. And with the 3 that were in the compound, he had multiple children during the time that he was in the compound. And just by way of illustration of the lengths to which they were going to protect the secrecy, they wanted to make sure that the wife then delivering wouldn't speak, so that the cover story was what? She was deaf and dumb.
Right. I mean, why would a woman that was clearly from the Middle East be having kids in a relatively obscure provincial Pakistani city? And so to cover that up, they used false identity papers for this wife. This was the youngest wife, who was 28 at the time bin Laden died or was killed. She had 2 kids when they were living in Abbottabad, Pakistan, and 2 other kids when they were wandering around other parts of Pakistan. So yes, the cover story, you say, Michael, was that she was deaf and mute, and that would prevent any awkward questions about why this woman, who clearly wasn't a local, was having these kids in these Pakistani cities, thousands of miles from the Middle East.
He's living in Abbottabad in that compound, and he is nevertheless a voracious consumer of media to the extent that he can get his hands on it. He has a digital library, and I guess this speaks well of his respect of your knowledge of him. Included in that digital library was one of your books.
Yeah, I mean, he was a voracious consumer of anything to do with Al-Qaeda or bin Laden. He had reports from the RAND Corporation. He had congressional testimony. He had an audio version of one of my books. He was a big fan of Michael Scheuer. Michael, you'll recall, ran the Alex station, which was the bin Laden unit before 9/11, who wrote a lot of very critical books about American foreign policy when he left the CIA. He had Bob Woodward books. He had quite a library. He even had one book that claimed that 9/11 was an inside job, which of course bin Laden himself knew was completely wrong, since he was the mastermind of the operation. So he was reading a lot, but the way he got those materials was he was not connected to the internet. Everything was being transported to him on thumb drives by his bodyguards, who would go and kind of like download newspapers, books, reports. I presume he must have tasked his bodyguards to go and get specific things, or people brought things to him that might be of interest to him. So he had a lot of time on his hands. So he was reading, and he was also writing these very long memos. And of course, one of the a key source for the book is the 470,000 files that were released by the Trump administration in full, that were recovered at the compound by the U.S. Navy SEALs. Which really provide a good roadmap to kind of how he was thinking, what he was doing, how he was trying to control his organization, both on a personal level and also kind of on an organizational level, what he was doing.
Peter, what most surprised you when you got your hands on those files? What is it that you, Peter Bergen, who had met bin Laden, who had interviewed bin Laden, who toured, and we'll come to that, the Abbottabad compound before it was razed, what took your breath away in looking at that documentation?
I mean, I was surprised by the extent to which that he was reliant on his two older wives to do his writing, his thinking for him. As I mentioned, that two of them had PhDs. One was in child psychology. The other one was in Quranic grammar. His oldest wife, Hamza, is 8 years older than bin Laden. She had been out of his life for a decade after 9/11. She lived under house arrest in Iran. On February 15, 2011, a few months before he was killed, she suddenly reappeared in the compound, and bin Laden was delighted. And he sent her these letters, or almost lovelorn letters, telling her how excited he was that she was coming back, and volunteering to come and pick her up 300 miles from the compound, which would have been a big risk to him. In the end, he didn't do that. She made her own way to the compound. But the bin Laden family journal recounts these long sessions before dinner, after dinner, where they talked about the events of the Arab Spring and how bin Laden should respond to it, because the fact that these revolutions were happening around the Middle East was tremendously exciting to bin Laden, but he was well aware that no one was holding aloft banners of bin Laden. Al-Qaeda wasn't involved. His ideas weren't involved, and so he was turning to his oldest wives and also his adult children to have these discussions about what should he say, how should he present himself, so he could suddenly become a leader of the Arab Spring. Now, this, of course, was a huge delusion. The people involved in the Arab Spring, particularly at the beginning, were liberals or members of the Muslim Brotherhood, a group that is involved in conventional politics that Al-Qaeda despises. But they were having these long sessions to say, bin Laden's family members saw him as a world historical figure, even though he was becoming less and less relevant. And they thought if he delivered a speech, he could kind of take control of the events of the Arab Spring in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya, where these revolutions were going on.
You walk us through Osama bin Laden's life. You paint the full picture. And of course, the events that transpired with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, 1979, United States and bin Laden temporarily on the same side of the fence. I've always wondered whether there was direct linkage between the CIA and bin Laden during that time period. You seem to have the answer to that question. What is it?
There's just no evidence for it, Michael. And we're now 4 decades after the end of that war, and no evidence has emerged. There's no document, there's no person who's come forward. It would also kind of defy common sense. The CIA wanted to win the war in Afghanistan, and there are 175,000 Afghans. That's the minimum estimate on the battlefield at any moment. And at the most, there were 300 Arabs under bin Laden's kind of command on the battlefield. They had no impact on the war. So the CIA officers were not allowed to go into Afghanistan because it would have been a huge propaganda victory for the Soviets if one of them was captured. B, they dealt with the Pakistani intelligence service when they were arming the Afghan warlords. They didn't deal with the Afghans themselves. They certainly didn't deal with the Arabs like bin Laden, who came to the Afghan war. And those Arabs had their own sources of funding, whether it was bin Laden's own personal money or donations that bin Laden was very successful in getting from interested parties in Saudi Arabia. So there's no evidence that the CIA had no idea who bin Laden was, by the way, Michael. I mean, it wasn't until 1993 that Gina Bennett, a young analyst at the State Department, wrote the first official account warning of this guy, Osama bin Laden. She was a junior analyst at the Intelligence Bureau at the State Department, and she became very interested in this phenomenon. But it's the first time the government warned internally about bin Laden. It was a classified document, was in 1993. So they simply had no idea who he was until 4 years after the war against the Soviets had ended.
By the way, you referenced Gina Bennett and her work throughout the course of the book, and I wondered as I read, is she the analyst who was a focal point of the movie Zero Dark 30?
Zero Dark 30 presented itself as a work of history, but really was a drama. And Gina Bennett is still at the CIA. She's attached to the National Counterterrorism Center. The character in Zero Dark 30, played by Jessica Chastain, is kind of a composite of different people, and it's certainly not Gina Bennett. Gina, joined the State Department in 1988, and is still at the agency. And there might be an element or two of her in that character, but that character is a composite. And the film itself, I don't think it's a particularly reliable guide to actually what happened. It's Hollywood, right?
Peter, how close did we come to getting him before September 11?
Well, that is a good question. There was a big, that I think there's a kind of agreement that there was in 1999, there was a group of Emiratis who were hunting bustards in the deserts of southern Afghanistan. There's a particular kind of bustard that's regarded as an aphrodisiac if you eat it. And Gulf princes like to hunt this bustard. And bin Laden was visiting this camp for a period of a week or so, going back and forth, having dinner with these guys. And I think that was probably the most likely time that you could have taken a shot at him, because collateral damage would have been relatively limited. It wasn't in a city. A lot of the other times bin Laden was in relatively large cities when there was information about his whereabouts. The shot wasn't taken. There was a concern that the people in this camp were members of the Emirati royal family, a legitimate concern, since there was a military C-130 Emirati plane near this camp. The shot was never taken. It seems that bin Laden probably was there, but folks at the White House sort of said the intelligence wasn't good enough. And in the pre-9/11 era, there was, it was pre-9/11. Bin Laden hadn't carried out the 9/11 attacks. And of course, at the other time, it was the Battle of Tora Bora after 9/11, and there was plenty of information. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that, the world didn't yet recognize what we had on our hands with bin Laden, but some people did. And I thought that your treatment in the book of Michael Scheuer was very fair and very favorable. It was Scheuer who ran what he named the Alex Station. It was his job in that time period to track bin Laden. He was an advocate for taking bin Laden out. I will tell you, Peter, that for a long time period, he had been a frequent guest on my radio program, a couple of times on television as well. And then we kind of lost touch, and he seemed in some respects to go off the deep end. But when it comes to bin Laden, he seems to have been right.
Yeah, he would tell people this guy's going to kill thousands of Americans. And he was constantly writing notes to various people at the agency saying, we're going to regret not taking action. This is before 9/11. And in the end, Scheuer was shuffled off the CIA library in a kind of make-work job because of his zealotry about bin Laden. But he was absolutely right. And Mike Scheuer is a very smart guy, a PhD in history. And he was completely right about bin Laden. Go ahead.
I was going to say, in the same way that he was sounding an alarm much closer in time, and something that I learned from the book is that you, on August 17, 2001, I emailed John Burns, the New York Times leading foreign correspondent. Why were you emailing him? What message did you want to convey?
Well, I'd met John in Yemen when we were both reporting on the USS Cole attack, which was carried out by Al-Qaeda, and when I was reporting on bin Laden. And John had won, I think, 3 Pulitzer Prizes, and was kind of the dean of foreign correspondence at the New York Times. And I was very concerned about this audio tape that was available in password-protected Al-Qaeda linked sites. And this videotape showed that it was a 2-hour videotape, and bin Laden was making all these threats on these videotapes, and he was saying that the attack on the USS Cole was just the beginning. And I thought it was part of a pattern where bin Laden warned of upcoming attacks and presaged an attack. And I wrote to John Burns laying out, I wrote him a 4-page letter, which I briefly quote in the book, sort of explaining why I thought this was something that he should report on, in the New York Times. And he wrote a piece, and the Times had an editing dispute, and they only put the version of the piece in the newspaper on September 12, 2001, unfortunately, after the attack had happened. But the title of the piece was I think it was on videotape, Bin Laden Charts a Violent Future was the title of the piece. So, you didn't, the reason I put the anecdote in the book is you didn't need access to classified information in the summer of 2001 to have a pretty good suspicion that something was brewing.
Well, but it also corresponds with the PDB that was delivered to President George W. Bush in Crawford. I know I'm moving fast. You raise questions, I should say you raise some doubt as to who among the SEAL Team 6 members actually killed him. In one of the footnotes to the book, the point man, O'Neill, and Bissonnette were the first 3 SEALs to assault bin Laden's bedroom. O'Neill has since claimed that he was the shooter who killed bin Laden. Others on the raid team told the author, you, that O'Neill's account wasn't accurate. To determine definitively which of the SEALs killed bin Laden is not possible. Can you just briefly explain why?
I think there's a few things here, Michael. One, this was, a raid against the world's most wanted man, and there's a lot of adrenaline coursing through everybody's veins. 2, there was no light on in the whole neighborhood, and all the SEALs are on night vision goggles. 3, so there is some dispute about what happened in that room. I can't really resolve it. All I can say is O'Neill has claimed that he was the man who took the fatal shot. The point man has never come forward and will never come forward. A lot of his colleagues think that he probably fatally wounded bin Laden with a first shot up the stairs. Matt Bissonnette, who has come forward publicly, says that he and O'Neill kind of finished off bin Laden when he was already on the floor. When I talked to Admiral McCraven about this issue, he in a sense, he sort of said, look, it doesn't really matter who took the final shot. This was a team effort, not just the SEAL teams, but everybody who served in Afghanistan was kind of driving towards this moment on the SEAL teams. There were 24 men on that raid, including a Pashtun, somebody who spoke the local language, a dog. Everybody had a role to play. So McCraven's view is, I think, that it ultimately doesn't really matter because
I agree with that. Look, to me, they're all heroes, but I'd be less than honest if I didn't say that it was a matter of curiosity. Soon after SEAL Team 6 killed bin Laden, you were, correct me if I'm wrong, the only Western journalist to tour the Abbottabad compound before it was razed by the Pakistanis. What most stands out in your mind about that experience?
I didn't know they were going to raise it, which they did 2 weeks later. I mean, the first thing is that it allowed me to get a sense of what happened on the night of the raid. There've been Cy Hirsch, the investigative journalist, has claimed that it wasn't really a real raid, that this whole thing was kind of like the fake moon landing. Well, I mean, I saw evidence of an extremely violent. The SEALs killed 5 people on that compound. Bin Laden, his son Khalid, 2 of the bodyguards, and one of the bodyguards' wives. The place was a total wreck. Evidence of a lot of firefights, and then also, the other thing that struck me is how run down and shabby the compound was. Bin Laden always lived. He came from a very rich family, but he always lived like a pauper. He was kind of a miserly guy. These people were not living large. They were living. It was a very crude kind of furniture. The whole place, it seemed run down, and that wasn't surprising to me because bin Laden, when he lived in Sudan, when he lived in southern Afghanistan, he lived in places without air conditioning. He even without running water. He seemed to really want to live this life of kind of abjuring any kind of modern luxury, and so
telling his sons, yeah, I may have millions, but you're never touching any of it.
Right. When one of his sons went to bin Laden and said, I'd like to get married and get some money, bin Laden said, why don't you I'm not going to give you anything. My money is for the jihad. You need to go out and,
Farm
raise
land.
crops and do some farming and raise some of your own
Right.
money, then get married.
A final thought, if I may. I have just a minute left with Peter Bergen. The book is called The Rise and Fall of Osama bin Laden, and it is excellent. I'm so glad that you closed the loop on Mohammed al-Qahtani, because one of my favorite aspects of September 11 is the story of Jose Melendez Perez, an astute CBT officer who kept out Customs and Border Protection, whatever the hell the acronym is, kept out of Orlando a month before September 11. Mohammed al-Qahtani, the presumed 20th hijacker, who later is captured at Tora Bora and at Guantanamo, and you explain this, is a key piece of evidence to take us to one of the couriers who leads us to bin Laden's door, meaning but for Jose Melendez Perez being so astute at his job a month before September 11, there could have been added muscle on Flight 93. Can you, in 30 seconds, tell me anything about Qahtani?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. Look, Flight 93 could have flown straight into the U.S. Capitol. That was the plan, with a fifth hijacker, and Qahtani was turned back. And I think you're absolutely right. It's one of the great sort of what ifs. I mean, luckily, he was turned away. He did deliver important information about the Kuwaiti, the courier. He did that in Guantanamo. He was subjected to some coercive interrogations. So there was, people wanted to defend the coercive interrogation program. Qahtani is sort of evidence for eliciting useful information, but the CIA also interrogated 5 other of al-Qaeda members who were senior members of al-Qaeda and used coercive interrogation techniques, and those produced either misleading information or false information. So that debate will linger on.
I raise it only to praise Jose Melendez Perez, who never got his just due. Peter Bergen, the book's tremendous. Thank you so much for writing it, investing all of that time, and for your willingness to be here discussing it.
Thank you, Michael.